Shema Yisrael Adonai.
Welcome to the broadcast outreach of Living God Ministries' Aaron Budjen. Aaron came to know Jesus as his Messiah while preparing to become a rabbi many years ago and is now the pastor of By Grace Fellowship in Denver, Colorado. Strongly distinguishing the Old and New Covenants, Aaron reveals the grace and truth of the Lord Jesus Christ from a historical and Judaic frame of reference. Join Aaron now as he reveals the reality of what was foreshadowed and the new life we now have in the resurrection.
I received a very good question recently, and so I thought I would take the opportunity on this broadcast to answer it. The question comes from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 4. And in Matthew chapter 23, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." The question comes from this passage in Scriptures, and the question has to do with them telling us to observe certain things, and even though they do not observe those things, shouldn't we also be observing those things? For example, there were many things that the Pharisees taught that we should do, and there were many things that we should not do. And so if that's the case, then should we not observe everything that they have said? Is that what Jesus is communicating here? Is Jesus telling us that we need to observe everything that the Pharisees told us to observe? And this is a very interesting question, because when you look at the ministry of the Lord Jesus, and you look at the conflicts that he was having with the Pharisees, and you look at what they were arguing about and why they had their disagreements, and why the scribes and Pharisees rejected the Lord Jesus as the Messiah, the disagreements that they had to do with what the Pharisees and the scribes said that a person should be doing, and the Lord Jesus was not performing those things. He was not subscribing to those things. For example, they taught that you were not allowed to do any healings on the Sabbath day, unless, of course, someone's life was in complete jeopardy. In that circumstance, they would allow that without any conflict. But there were other things that they taught. For example, before you ate a meal, you had to wash your hands, and of course your hands would have to be washed in a certain way, and there was a prescribed methodology by which they would do that. And there were other laws. For example, you were not to walk on the grass on the Sabbath day. And these were things that the Lord Jesus did against their traditions, against what they taught that a person should observe and what a person should do. So why would it be that the Lord Jesus, all of a sudden, here in Matthew chapter 23, why would he be telling us that we are now to observe those things that they tell us that we should observe, when his whole ministry appeared to be reflective of violating many of the things that they taught that we should be observing? This appears to be a contradiction. And when looking at it carefully, it's very reasonable to assume that there is a contradiction here. But there is an answer to this question, and there is an explanation as to why this is written the way it is. And in this program, I'll be taking the time to explain the details with respect to this passage. Now, to do this, I'd like to first give you some historical background about what they taught, how they taught it, what it means to be in Moses' seat, and where they were coming from in terms of what people should be observing and what people should not be observing, and what people should be doing and what people should not be doing. Where did they actually come up with these ideas that a person should be doing certain things or living in certain ways? The history of this begins back in Babylon. In Babylon, the rabbis of the people in that time period discovered that the reason why the people were in captivity was because they disobeyed the law of God. It was because they sinned. And so in discovering this for themselves, it was obvious to probably everyone else, but for themselves they acknowledged that this was a reality and this was a real problem that needed to be resolved. To deal with this problem, the way that they decided to deal with it was to try and create a lifestyle to live by, a way of living, things that they would observe, things that they would do, things that they would not do, and certain works that they would perform and certain things that they would not perform. They decided to construct an entire lifestyle that would create somewhat of a fence around the law of Moses. The purpose of this was to ensure that you would never come within the boundaries of possibly violating the law of Moses. That was the intent of this, and many of us in Christianity could relate to this very well. We have in Christianity very similar concepts. For example, people will have a Christian lifestyle that they would live with hopes that through living through that lifestyle, they would never come within the boundaries of violating any of the Ten Commandments. This is just one example. They don't call these things laws. In general, they call them hedges around your life or principles to be applied in order to ensure that you don't sin. But either way, it's very common, it's very natural for people to do that, because in general, we don't really want to violate the law of God. If we want to serve our God, if we want to follow our God, if we want to know our God and be pleasing to Him, in general, we don't want to violate His laws and His commandments. And so this is one direction that people will take in order to try and ensure that they don't violate any of these laws. Well, the rabbis, when they got together and they decided to construct this lifestyle that they would live by, they all made one agreement, and that was that while they might disagree with each other about how they would live and the things that they would do and observe, they would not disagree with Moses. That was the criteria that they established for declaring what they would determine to be a good, observant type of lifestyle in order to try and avoid violating the commandments of God. And so they all agreed to disagree if it came to that, but they all agreed that they would not violate or disagree with Moses in any way whatsoever. These specific rabbis were identified as the sophers. It is a word that is derived from the word for book in Hebrew. It's a very good word, and it's a word that identified this specific group of people. And what they decided, what they determined, was documented into what is called the Mishnah. That is where their teachings were documented, and these teachings were passed on from rabbi to rabbi over the generations. A major decision was made several hundred years later in the rabbinical community. The decision was that the writings of the sophers in the Mishnah were considered to be sacrosanct. Or more correctly, what they decided was that there was no disagreement amongst the sophers. It was a very radical decision, and it really had no basis, but they decided that, and that's what they determined, and they declared this to be the oral law, the second Torah that was passed on by Moses orally, that had never really been written down, but it was something that was transmitted orally from person to person all the way down throughout the course of history until this point in history when they decided that it was officially the oral law. And even though it was passed down orally, there were still documents that existed that testified of what the sophers decided, and that was considered to be the Mishnah. Now, in making this very radical decision, they would have some problems that needed to be resolved. What are they going to do about the disagreements that existed between the sophers? Because when they originally decided that they would try to construct their own lifestyles to try and live in obedience to the law, they agreed that they would disagree with each other. But now there is a major challenge, and that is, how are we going to reconcile the differences that are quite obvious in the Mishnah? And so to do that, there would be a huge effort that would be undergone by the Pharisees and the scribes, whereas they would argue and debate and consistently try to find ways of reconciling any differences that might exist. And to do that, it would obviously require a significant explanation for each of the disagreements that might exist between the different sophers in order to reconcile them and in order to justify their position that they were transmitting the oral law from Moses and that we were to observe everything that the sophers were saying. Well, to do this, it required a significant effort, and the result of that is what is called the Gemara. The Gemara is a huge, monstrous text, a huge encyclopedic text that is the explanation or the commentary on the Mishnah, which is effectively the commentary on the Torah. That is how these things are organized. And the Mishnah and the Gemara together comprise what is known as the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was not officially documented until a few hundred years after Christ, but its integrity was well maintained and well intact by that time before they decided to actually formalize it in text. Before then, it was well understood, and it was perpetuated very well through the rabbinical teachings of the Pharisees throughout the centuries that they were developing this lifestyle and reconciling any potential differences. And so this was the foundation for their lifestyle, for their way of life, but not everything was covered within the Mishnah and the Gemara. Not everything in life was covered through their lifestyle, through what they examined in the law of Moses and how they constructed their lifestyle around that. Not everything was covered. There were some aspects of life that they did not have formal decisions on, that they did not have formal explanations of. Let me give you an example. How would somebody put on their shoes? This is a very good example. If people are going to put on their shoes, then what is the right way to put on their shoes? And as you go through the law of Moses, there is no clear explanation as to how a person would properly put on their shoes. But this is a very important part of life because we put our shoes on every day, sometimes more than once. And if this is the case, then we must have a righteous and holy way to actually put on our shoes. And if you're wondering if this is true, absolutely. Every aspect of our lives are governed by some aspect of law that has been determined by our rabbis. And this is just one very small example, but it is a very important one. How would they determine how to put on their shoes? Well, the decision was that if we don't have anything formally presented through Moses or through the Sophers, or the rabbi's interpretation of what the Sophers had said, then all we can really do is observe those rabbis that we consider to be holy, that we consider to be righteous men of God, and see how it is that they put on their shoes. And if they put on their shoes a certain way, then that is the way that we are to put on our shoes. And that's exactly what they did. They observed one very prominent rabbi, and he put on his shoes in this specific way. First he put on his right shoe, then he put on his left shoe. And then he tied his left shoe, and then he tied his right shoe. And this became the foundation for putting on everyone's shoes for several hundred years, for thousands of years now. How it is that all the Orthodox rabbis and how all the Orthodox believers in Moses will now put on their shoes is to put on your right shoe, then your left, and tie your left, and then your right. No other way. If you put your shoes on any other way, then you will effectively be violating the precepts or the ordinances, the ways of living that have been defined by our rabbis for centuries. And to do that, in many ways, is considered to be sin. And so we just don't do that. We just consistently put on our shoes in the way that we are supposed to. Now, these laws that correspond to those things that we don't have laws for, that are just determined through observing our rabbis, through observing those who we hold in high regard and high honor and high esteem, these laws are classified into what is referred to as the takanot. And so you have a new classification of laws, and these are very important to understand when explaining the verse that I'm referring to, because if you don't understand where all these additional laws are coming from, you're not going to really appreciate my explanation very well. And so understand that there were three major classifications beyond Moses. There was the law of Moses, there was the Mishnah of the Sophers, there was the Gemara of the rabbis trying to reconcile the disagreements between the Sophers, and there was the takanot. The takanot being the additional laws that were presented of things that we should observe and do in order to try and ensure that we consistently live a holy and righteous lifestyle before our God.